And he'd say, great, grab this pole, we're gonna start draining your blood, slap some leeches on that bad boy, and we'll have you out of here with a fade and a deadly infection in no time. What's up guys, James here with Fun Fact of the Day. Hope you guys are having a great day, learning lots, and getting stuff done. Today, we're here to talk about the mystery of why there are spinning, weird red, white, and blue poles outside of barber shops. So, let's get into it. Let's start with the history of why barbers are a thing in general. Back in about 3500 BC in ancient Egypt, priests were actually barbers, and they were that way because shaving hair and body hair off of people in certain ways was a way to ward off evil spirits with different haircuts. This continued to spread across Western society all the way throughout the next 3,000 or 4,000 years until about the 5th century AD, where in Rome and Greece, barbers at that point were actually an every single day part of life. People would stop at them on their way to work to get a shave and, chat up the juicy gossip for the day. At this point, barbers were actually still priests, and they were surgeons because they were the only ones who knew how to use a knife well. And so this continued for a few hundred years until about the 12th century, when most of the European kings all decided that priests should no longer be able to do surgeries because it contradicts all of the things that they believed as religious beliefs. Basically, surgery isn't praying for health, therefore they can't be surgeons. So, somebody else had to do it. So basically, the few barbers who weren't priests took on the role of both barber, surgeon, and dentist. That's right, they did everything. So if you needed anything done at all, from an amputation to a haircut and a shave, you went to the exact same guy. They even did brain drilling, where they would drill through your skull to relieve the pressure and release evil spirits that caused mental illness, depression, epilepsy, all sorts of things. So they tripled as a psychiatrist as well. Now, aside from cutting hair, pulling teeth, and accidentally killing all of their surgery clients through infection, they did the two most common medical procedures of the day: bloodletting and leeching. And they did them all the time. Bloodletting is essentially a procedure where you would squeeze a pole and it would make all of your forearm veins pop out. And then they would take this little tool and they'd prick your vein and drain a ton of your blood, usually way too much, into a big bowl. The goal of this was to get rid of all of the bad blood that had whatever sickness or illness you were feeling, and then hopefully, after they've clotted it all up, you will regrow new healthy blood. And the leeching was kind of a similar concept. They'd suck your blood. Leeches are supposed to have some antibacterial properties, yada yada. So here's how a basic interaction with your barber, dentist, surgeon would go down. Basically, you'd walk in with, let's say, a sprained wrist, and you'd say, hey doc, I need help. And he'd say, great, grab this pole, we're gonna start draining your blood, slap some leeches on that bad boy, and we'll have you out of here with a fade and a deadly infection in no time. Now here is where the pole's history starts to come into play. You see, they would take these bowls of blood that people would get from bloodletting, and they'd put them out on the windowsill to advertise that they were a barber, dentist, surgeon. They would also string teeth because, that's fun. And the problem with that is that after a while it became kind of unsanitary, and so a bunch of the kings in the area outlawed it. And they needed to advertise somehow because Yelp wasn't really around and nobody could read a basic sign that said barber, surgeon, dentist. So they had to do something else. So what they did was they took a bunch of the extra poles that they had from, people squeezing them, and they wrapped them in bloody rags that they had used to clot blood after some bloodletting. And then they'd put them outside in front of their place to show that they were a barber, surgeon, dentist. And this is the very beginning of the pole's history. You see, this actually continued for years and years and years, over 500 years, until about the 1700s. At this point, they had started to use more paint than bloody rags, just because a lot of this was happening in places like England, where there's rain and blood would wash off immediately. But the point is, they still had these poles. But at that point, in the mid-1700s, surgeons and haircutters split up. They decided that maybe haircutters shouldn't also be surgeons, and a bunch of surgeon societies were formed. And so what happened was the government mandated that they had to advertise differently. And so the surgeons were given blue poles, and then the haircutters, because they already had their shops all set up, were given red poles, which they already had. And so this is where we basically have to guess where the history of these barber poles actually came from. We know for a fact that we had red swirly poles because those were the haircutting poles. And we know for a fact that we had blue swirly poles because those were the surgeons' poles. And then, in the United States, we usually have red, white, and blue poles, which is basically just a combination of the two, plus it's patriotic, and most of them started popping up in really patriotic times in like the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Then, the next part to talk about is the brass end caps. People specifically think that the brass end caps are there to represent the bowls that they used to keep leeches in. You see, brass is a very antibacterial metal because it has a bunch of copper in it, and so it was a good place to store leeches. But I think that's kind of a stretch. Frankly, I think it's just there for looks. And then the spinning portion, people claim, is there because back when they were bloody ragged poles, in theory, they would spin in the wind. But I'm not quite sold on that theory. I think it's just there because it's a great way to get people's attention with a moving object outside your store. Basic advertising. And that is the story of how surgeon dentist haircutters created the spinning poles that we now see outside of all haircutting stores today. If you enjoyed this video at all and you'd like to see anything similar or even better, click the playlist right here. I have a whole bunch of them just for you, and like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out a lot, it means a lot to me, and it only takes you 1 second to do, so I'd really appreciate it if you did it, and I will see you tomorrow or the next day, because these take a while to make.